edition of DSA 2026. This is the JID, Journal of International Development, sponsored plenary. I hope you're having a great conference so far and an even better one over the next 1.5 days. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Naila Kabeer, who is going to be giving a talk on reimagining pathways to gender justice in an era of uncertainty. Professor Naila Kabeer is a professor emeritus at the Department of International Development, London School of Economics. She's also affiliated to a number of different institutions, or rather, shall I say, the institutions are affiliated to her, like the International Inequalities Institute. Her work has had an enduring impact on a lot of different areas in the field of international development, in the field of development studies. So it has been a spanning career and a really overwhelmingly amazing career that she has had. She has contributed quite centrally. A lot of things have become synonymous with her name, to the area of gender, to the area of development, to the area of social inclusion, labor, inequalities, and of course, gender justice. Many of us know her through her iconic works. I'm going to mention just a couple because otherwise I'll be here for the full 45 minutes. The one book that stands out in my mind is Reversed Realities. You know, the book that was published in 1994. The reason I mention it is because it had an enduring impact on my career choices, on, what research pathway I wanted to go to. And it remains one of those rare books that speaks across generations to students, practitioners, and researchers. And then we come, missing all those many books in the middle, to her recent book published in 2024 by LSE as an open access book, Renegotiating Patriarchy, Gender Agency, and the Bangladesh Paradox, where she continues this amazing intellectual journey, where she not only tells us about how gendered power is reproduced, but how it is contested, how it is renegotiated and transformed in everyday lives. I wanted to introduce Naila not only through, obviously, her formal contributions that are many, but also through two small anecdotes. There was a time when I was sharing a book panel with her many years back in Washington, and I remember one of the books that we were discussing had cited her work 188 times. I am not sure many of us can, claim to being cited in one single volume so many times. But in that time, in that moment, it somehow did not feel excessive. And then there was a panel that happened yesterday where one of the authors said something much more direct. They said, Naila, your book has changed my life. Now, we talk about influence through things like citations, impact factor, and, all kinds of policy influence and so on. But these are influences that are much more priceless, that cannot really be measured. How a piece of work can change the way we understand the world around us. We understand our situation in that world, how we position ourselves in the world, and then we start reimagining on how to change it. And that is the space that Naila occupies in our field and has influenced many of the things that many of us do. She is very active, even beyond academia. She has advised as an advisor for international organizations like the World Bank, UNDP, UN Women, and also NGOs like Oxfam, and also regional organizations like BRAC and Pradhan. She continues to be a prolific contributor to global debates on inequalities and on contested gender justices. Her plenary comes very, very timely. We are living amidst an era of uncertainties where we not only have climate change and real pressure on development finance, but we also have a new space where gender justice is being contested again. The gender space is being contested. So please join me in welcoming Naila Kabeer to her plenary.
Thank you, Supriya. I feel quite humbled by all that. And now I feel she sort of raised the bar as to what you're expecting. But I am very pleased to be talking about this topic. And I thank JID and I thank DSA for inviting me. As Supriya said, this is a presentation of a particular era that we're living through. One of has been described as polycrisis, uncertainty and insecurity. And what I find is a lot of the conversation is talking about climate change, a lot of the conversation is talking about inequalities, but very often it misses out on what is central to both, and that is the whole issue of gender injustice. So what I'd like to do today is try and make a link between these three injustices in the world. Let me start by a few concepts that we all know about. Markets. Markets have existed for a very long time, wherever buyers and sellers meet together and exchange their goods and services, and the forces of supply and demand determine the prices. And money enables that exchange. GDP, relatively new, 1950s, measures the market value of all finished goods and services that could enter market transactions in a country within a given period. It has its problems, we are aware, that it leaves out the value of unpaid care, leaves out the value of nature and ecological resources. It is indifferent to distribution, and it doesn't care about what the composition of GDP is. So harmful goods are given the same value, market value as less harmful goods. The third is economic growth. Some preoccupation with economic growth has always been there, but the GDP allows us to measure it. And economic growth is, of course, measured over time as the increase in the value or decrease in the value of goods and services. But my question here today is what happens when the markets that we talk about are regarded as self-regulating mechanisms that are capable of achieving the most efficient allocation of scarce resources as measured by the GDP? Now, an early answer to this that was given before the GDP came into existence was given by Karl Polanyi and his book on the Great Transformation. And he pointed out at the beginning of industrialization in Britain, the rise of the capitalist class, there was pressure on the state to dismantle all forms of protection and to allow market forces freedom so that they could somehow gain a greater share of the greater wealth that was being generated. So this transformation actually flipped societies from those where market production of goods was somehow curtailed or governed by moral forces, by the community, by the state, by where you lived. You didn't just treat everything as a marketable commodity. But this great transformation was about doing just that. All inputs and outputs that entered market transactions were regarded as commodities that were produced for sale. But as Polanyi pointed out, not all of these commodities could be regarded as commodities in the market sense of the word. Some were fictitious commodities. They had been produced not for sale in the marketplace, but for other reasons. So for instance, labor, which is the sum total of the activities that we do in order to earn a living, was not produced for the market. Nature is there, naturally evolving. It was not produced for the market. And money was a medium of exchange, but not a commodity in and of itself. And he pointed out by treating these commodities as though they were simply these fictitious commodities, as though they were produced for the market, led to very destructive effects in the economy. Labor, what we saw is that Treating labor as something that could be bought and sold without any regard for its consequences led to the landlessness, led to the destruction of human capacity, led to the uprooting of communities and families. Treating land and its produce as just another commodity meant that you could now despoil nature, not only in your own country, but you could roam, capital was free to roam the world, despoiling nature in other parts of the world. And money, treating money as though it was a commodity, led to the rise of global markets in capital and currency under the aegis of the gold standard, and led to unbridled speculation and all the bubbles, etc., that we saw. But at the same time, what Kablani said is that these destructive effects led to a counter-movement on the part of society as those who were suffering sought to protect themselves. So before things could be resolved, we saw the world wars, we saw the rise of fascism, we saw the Great Depression. And it was only after the Second World War that the struggle between the state and capital, between capital and labor over what the state should be about, gave rise to a much more interventionist state, a welfare state in the north and the development state in the south. Now, there's been a recent revival of interest in Polanyi's work. I think Guy Standing was mentioned, Nancy Fraser as well. Nancy Fraser's work, I think, is particularly important because she adds a feminist perspective to Polanyi's work. First of all, she questions the idea of what she calls the ontological status of fictitious commodities. She says they may not have been produced for the market, but they did not exist before that in a pristine state. They were always embedded in unequal power relations. Labor in slavery, in colonialism, feudalism and land, and so on. So it was not as though markets came along and somehow destroyed some purity. They were always embedded in relations of power. She also questioned the idea that the omission of reproductive labor. She pointed out that, yes, it is true that commodified labor was operational in the marketplace, but it was nevertheless produced, not for the market, but it was produced, and was produced by the daily and intergenerational basis by the non-commodified labor produced primarily by women and girls in the rest of the world. So she said, we shouldn't sort of act as though the communities in which these commodities existed are somehow to be preserved. So to the movement for social protection, she added the movement for emancipation. Emancipation that could sometimes come about through engagement in the marketplace. So when we look at lower caste people in India, the move from clientelism to commodity is often a move from being devalued to becoming impersonal. For many women, move from households into markets can also come with a certain degree of liberation. So she picks up the story where Polanyi left off, and she talks about how after the Second World War, we saw the colonial relationship between the North and South replaced by a neo-colonial relationship of extraction. But we also saw the rise of the state and the role of the state in all these different countries. So we saw, as I said earlier, for the industrial North, it was a golden age of capitalism. The Bretton Woods summit anchored international currencies to the US dollar and the dollar to US gold reserves and allowed predictable exchange rates. The Fordist organization of industrial production gave rise to a working class capable of fighting its own corner. It saw demands on the state to provide labor regulations. It also saw the extension of state provision to some of those reproductive services that women had been providing on an unpaid care basis because it was required for the market, for the labor, and because it was an investment in current and future labor force. Efforts along these lines were more uneven in the global South, but we did see the rise of a developmental state, putting tariffs, protecting industry, seeking to catch up with the North, and hoping one day that its labor too would enjoy some of the protections that were seen in the North. But of course, all of these aspirations were blown away by the crisis of the 1970s. And I will read here from Stiglitz, because it summarizes the rise in oil prices, the collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary system, abandonment of the gold standard, shift away from state-managed capitalism of the post-war period, which saw welfare regimes and developmental states, with the growing dominance of neoliberal ideas in Western countries and its imposition throughout the world through the lending practices of financial institutions. According to this, the market is once again the most efficient way of allocating resources. The private sector, driven by profit motives, is the best and most efficient way to mobilize investment, deliver services, organize society. Policies that follow this logic include deregulation of the financial sector, freeing up of global capital to move across borders, deregulation of labor markets to enable employers to more easily shed workers or pay lower wages, included policies to privatize state enterprises, services, and opening them up to private involvement in energy, water, transport, education, and the health sectors, amongst many. So what we are now living through is the consequences of this. So we've seen the commodification of money, the deregulation of capital markets, and financialization has brought into existence a whole new regime of financial risks and opportunities. New kinds of institutions have joined the traditional banking sector. So we have shadow banking institutions such as hedge funds, mutual funds, structured investment, most of which I do not understand. I don't understand what they do, how they earn their money. New risk transfer investments, securitization allows all assets to be pooled and repackaged into interest-bearing securities and traded on the market. And it's been accelerated by information technologies. And I have a nice little quote here, which I don't think I put. Oh, yes. High-frequency trading uses algorithms to buy and sell financial assets in fractions of seconds. In the 1960s, shares were held for about 4 years on average. Today, the average share is held for 20 seconds. What has been produced in those 20 seconds, I'd like to know. We have also seen a divergence between the growth in the real economy and the financial economy. So that, as Nancy Fraser put it, the financial economy has almost floated free of the real economy. So that in 1973, the ratio of value of, let us say, foreign exchanges in transactions, global trade was 2 to 1. 2004, it reached 90 to 1. In 2017, total value of global trade was 17.88 trillion. To date, it's 45 trillion. Increased likelihood of crisis, and here we come to the age of uncertainty. There has always been crisis, but there has been acceleration in the pace of crisis, in the frequency of crisis, and its contagion across the world. So now crises are no longer, confined to one country. We are all affected by it. And of course, what bothers us all is this relentless, unimaginable rise in inequality. So the richest 10%, you all heard these statistics, right? But I'll tell you again. Richest 10% of the global population commands 52% of global income. The poorest half earn 8.5%. The poorest half of the global population earns 2% of the global wealth. The richest 10% own 76%. So we are in that kind of world, and this is what has got us here. Commodification of nature. Polanyi talked about it, but he could not imagine what the commodification of nature was going to look like today. It has led to the privatization of water, bioengineering of sterile seeds, the patenting of DNA, and from trade in already existing natural resources to the generation of fresh markets in strange new entities such as carbon emission permits and offsets. The profitability of these new entities depends on the fact that the costs of environmental commodification are externalized, so that those responsible for them do not have to pay the price. But those costs do not go away. Those destructive effects do not go away. They are putting unprecedented stress on the Earth's life-giving system, giving rise to dramatic changes in climate, which may soon be irreversible. But the other part of it, of course, means that the drivers of the market logic driving climate change is neither contribution nor responsibilities evenly distributed. We know that those who have contributed most to climate destruction, beginning from the period of industrialization, are the ones who are paying the lowest costs. So while wealthy nations consume approximately 10 times more resources per person than developing countries, 20 countries account for more than 80% of all greenhouse gas emissions today. And while some of the wealthy countries are saying that their carbon footprint is going down, if you count the carbon intensiveness of what they import, their material footprint has not gone down. It continues to go up. So the essence of climate injustice is those who were responsible for it are not bearing the costs of it. Those who were least responsible for it are the ones who are bearing the cost. Then we have the commodification of labor. We saw that the dismantling of social protections as a part of the globalization and financialization of the economy. And the fact is that not only have the protections been dismantled, but as you become a part of the global economy, in order to be competitive, you have to further reduce the protections that you give to labor. It has been helped by technological change, which has allowed large tracts of labor to be part of value chains dispersed across the world. And of course, we've seen the rise of the gig economy. It's been helped by the fact that the current shift to just-in-time production and so on has weakened the power of organized labor. The kind of trade unions that we saw under the Fordist period are far weaker today. And it has not been helped, of course, commodification by the flow of migration. While remittances are very important for the countries from which the migrants come from, migrants themselves pay a very heavy price in terms of how much citizenship rights they are afforded. So the casualization of labor has been accompanied by a decline in labor's share of income. According to ILO, global labor income share fell by 0.6% just between 2019 and 2022. This compounds a long-run trend. If the share had remained the same as it was in 2004, it would have been larger by 2.4 trillion in 2024 alone. So then I turn to gender justice and gender injustice. And what I'd like to say, I want to use Gail Rubin's phrase, that we can think of patriarchal structures as characterized by a monotonous similarity and an endless variety. The monotonous similarity is around the world, wherever we look, women and girls are required to take primary responsibility for unpaid care and domestic work, while men are expected to take primary responsibility for breadwinning and earning. The endless variety is the extent to which women are also expected to participate in the productive and paid economy. And where they are expected, they are given some access to resources, they have a greater mobility in the public domain, and they're less likely to be defined as dependents. And these are the countries in which we see a much lower gap between health and mortality of men and women. But other parts of the world, and where I come from, South Asia and MENA, not only are women required to take on full responsibility for unpaid care, but they're required to look after their husbands and everybody else. So where you see a drop in the labor force at childbearing ages in much of the world, in these parts of the world, it is the marriage effect that comes in. Your labor force participation drops when you get married. But the gender gap in unpaid responsibilities varies across the world, partly because, as I've said, patriarchy itself varies across the world. But it also varies across the world according to the levels of state support. In many parts of Europe, etc., you do see childcare provision, you do see some degree of assistance with health, you can buy your market services and so on. But in the poorer parts of the world, that kind of assistance does not exist. And as more and more women enter the labor market to pursue the neoliberal dream, those who can afford outsource their domestic responsibilities to those less well off themselves and often racialized others. So at the global level, women spend 3 times more hours than men in unpaid work. They spend twice as much in OECD countries, 4 to 7 times more in MENA. I think it's called West Asia. It's called WENA now, West Asia and North Africa. 4 to 5, anyway, they just do much more work and more in some parts of the world than others. So we are looking at gender injustice, this injustice in an age of uncertainty. And as you can see, feminists have focused on this. So Maureen McIntosh back in 1981 said feminists are involved interest in the sexual division of labor because it appears to express, embody, and further perpetuate female subordination. Nancy Fraser in 2014, the division between paid productive labor and unpaid reproductive labor is overwhelmingly a gender division which underpins modern forms of capitalism. And Geeta Sen in Dawn, women stand at the crossroads between production and reproduction, economic activity and care of human beings, and therefore between economic growth and human development. They are the workers in both spheres, those most responsible and with most at stake, those who suffer most when the two work at cross purposes, and the most sensitive to the need of a better integration between the two. And what we have seen, of course, with the commodification of labor, we have seen the commodification of the kind of services they might have otherwise got through the state. Now, I've given a reference to a book, a paper in which I've summarized this, but it came as a surprise to me because most of my work has been focusing on getting women into paid work because I think that's a very important possibility. But this is a part of the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, and they asked me to write a paper on unpaid care work, gender, and the economy, and it was an eye-opener. And what I found is that, in the current era, when labor markets are the means by which most people earn a living and meet their needs, disadvantage in the labor market is a disadvantage in life. Now, of course, there are many things that underlie women's disadvantage in the labor market: ownership and control over resources, stereotypes, discrimination, violence, and so on. But the common thread across the world is their primary responsibility for unpaid domestic labor. It underlies, and it is not just feminists who are saying this, it is the World Bank, the IMF, ILO, everybody. Gender inequality in labor force participation, you can see by the 8 specific variations for women and not men, the extent to which unpaid work and childcare, etc., come into the picture. Gender inequalities in finding work, what are the main reasons? For men, it is often they're ill or they're in education. For women, it is often the unpaid domestic work. Gender inequalities in the type of work found. And of course, what we have seen is the commodification of female labor. And it very often takes a form that mirrors their reproductive roles. So you find women in teaching, in nursing, social services, and so on, where they are much more poorly paid. But interestingly, also, you find that what I've also found is that it has intruded, encroached into areas of the intimate domain in ways that we have never seen before. So, as Fraser says, the search for profits has extended into other areas of the reproductive economy, following the tendency to turn society into commodities all the way down. It has transformed the long-standing commodification of women's sexual services from what used to be small-scale cottage industries, often illegal, into large-scale, legalized and hugely profitable industry, which is part of the global economy and the cultural mainstream. In addition, it has brought other contested commodities onto the market. That includes surrogacy, big business across the world, and the sale of your body parts. Now, while those who support free market ideologies see these as transactions that are voluntarily entered into buyers and sellers, the enormous gap in wealth and status raises moral questions and concerns about the nature of the choice involved. And Marwa and Rudrupa have interviewed mothers who were surrogates. And those mothers don't say that they have engaged in a transaction. They say they sold their babies. There is no messing around with market ideologies. A further gender disadvantage, of course, returns to labor. And we find that women almost everywhere, and at the global level, 19% earn 19% less than men. And of course, the share of income, I think Kaushik was talking about the decline in labor share of income. Well, women earn, I think, around a third of labor income, but they do something like 55% of the world's labor, paid and unpaid. So what you have is these women earning a third of the labor income, not the capital income, and doing the majority of the world's work. And remember, that work is what keeps the economy alive. If they did not do that productive, reproductive, bearing babies, looking after people, elderly, et cetera, the economy would collapse. If all women withheld that reproductive labor, we would not have an economy. But one thing, of course, one should say is that having a disadvantage in the labor market, being marginalized from it, doesn't necessarily constitute a major disadvantage if there are other people in the house earning a living, right? Especially if there are male earners. But what we find is this is not the case. In many parts of the world, the UN Women have looked at the proportion of men and women living below the poverty line. And in almost all of the countries, the majority of the countries, many more women live below the poverty line than men. German researchers have used an individual multidimensional deprivation index, and they find that women make up like 60% of the poor and 74% of the multidimensional extreme poor. And of course, if we look at poverty and old age, we see the accumulation of gender disadvantage. And poor women are older women are far more likely to be found in poverty than older men. So it matters. It matters the fact that they don't have access to the only kinds of resources that are available, which is the market. If we turn to climate change, we are warned not to make stupid generalizations, right? Because climate change is happening without a human agency directly involved. So the subordinations and disadvantages that we see are going to reflect distributions that nobody really planned. So one thing we do know in climate change is the issue of health. And Lancet has pointed out it has huge issues of health and extreme heat. Now, in much of the world and in Europe, far more women die in the extreme heat, older women die in extreme heat than men. Interestingly, this is not the case in the United States. Far more older men die of extreme heat than women. One reason, of course, is men are much more likely to be involved in outdoor livelihoods, agriculture. But here's also interesting, older men are much more likely to suffer from social isolation. And that is a killer. Return to livelihoods again. Men are much, the gender segregated nature of the economy means that men are much more likely to be found in sectors of the economy which are vulnerable to climate change, which are contributing to climate change. But these are the sectors that are going to have to be phased down. But they are also in a better position to get the new jobs. But the large-scale exclusion of women in OECD countries, the exclusion means that women are much more likely to be found in care sectors. But in the global south, they are much more likely to be found in activities that depend on natural resources and therefore are vulnerable to climate change. These may be less environmentally destructive, small-scale farming, forestry, fishery, but they're also sensitive. And finally, of course, how do you cope? We know rich countries are coping better than poor countries. So a lot of the focus is on how are poor people in poor countries coping. And here again, we find that women are at a disadvantage. Men are more likely to be found in livelihoods that are resilient. Women are more likely to be found in livelihoods that are rain dependent or climate dependent. Men are much more likely to migrate to get out of whatever's going on. And I think somebody yesterday quoted this finding. Women are more likely to be found amongst internally displaced. Because the other thing that I find very, I could go on, but what has really struck me is when we have these natural disasters in Asia and Bangladesh, cyclones, tsunamis, 70% of deaths are women and children. Because women have not been allowed to run, allowed to swim, allowed to do climate release. So when these natural disasters happen, the fatalities are disproportionately women. But one set of generalizations, I'm trying not to generalize, but one set is that this care issue comes into the story. Climate change increases the amount of care work that people have to do. It makes care work more difficult to provide, particularly because it affects the health of well-being of the carers. Land degradation, deforestation, all of this reduces the availability of natural resources. And while migrants may go elsewhere in search of work, women's unpaid responsibilities increase. And thirdly, climate change often compounds the inequalities that already exist. So studies have established that fuel and water scarcity is associated with increases in women's labor time, physical strain, and increased likelihood of gender violence. And as you know, in many crises, including the pandemic, domestic violence tends to go up. So how are we responding to this era of uncertainty? I want to identify three mainstream responses around growth. The first is green growth. We modify growth by internalizing the costs of action, the cost of environmental damage. And that will make certain environmentally damaging goods and services more expensive. We will consume less, we will produce less, we will find our way to cleaner goods. The second is progressive growth, and this is associated with people like Joe Stiglitz, etc. What I really liked in this literature is Mariana Mazzucato's, metaphor of the war of the Apollo moonshot. That what you need is an economy that is organized around a common purpose. That everybody who is involved in that economy sees their mission as a mission to move away from destructive forms of consumption and production to more sustainable forms. So the markets remain, but they will now be managed by the state. And the third, of course, is the degrowth. that we cannot afford to wait till some technology comes along and saves the planet. And as we saw, even if some countries say that their carbon footprints are going down, their material footprints are going up. And so what they would like to see is a planned decline in the most environmentally destructive industries, many of which, of course, involve men. But they also show that the poorer countries of the world are well within their planetary boundaries. So if growth has to start to decline, it has to happen in those countries that have exceeded their planetary boundaries and have no more credit left. So they have a degrowth strategy, but it has to be one that is applied in a fair and just manner. So when we think about ourselves and I'm a part of this program, which is a pathway we should follow? Well, anyone that is going to continue relying on the market, and when we describe the unregulated market as a problem, is not going to be in line with our values. On the other hand, the degrowth economy is a bit radical, right? And it is scary, because even the green growth is going to impose costs on poor people. Can you imagine what will happen with the degrowth economy? So we've decided to go with the progressive growth strategy, but to think of what it offers that doesn't preclude a more radical future. To move ourselves towards this radical future, but not overnight and not in a kind of falling off the cliff way. So gender just pathways to an alternative economy. It seems to me that one of the hugest problems that we have been facing in the current is a question of values. To be successful in an unregulated, competitive market economy, you have to be competitive, you have to be greedy, you have to be ruthless, you have to have certain values, and we know that success is now measured by how much money you make, how many cars you have. So Polanyi's true criticism of the deregulated market was not that it was based on economics, but that the economy was based on self-interest. Stiglitz says the current economic system has incentivized greed, selfishness, moral turpitude, willingness to exploit others. Mazzucato points out how increased financialization has encouraged personal greed, increased prosperity, and consumerism have eroded the bonds of collectivities around the world. And Hickel, greed is not just an inalienable human trait, as we are told it is, but the driving force of a system that compels certain forms of behavior by normalizing ceaseless consumption and infinite growth. So I think what we need to have to start to do is to try and adopt in our cultures an alternative set of values. And if individual competition was the value of the market economy, we have to look at interdependence as an alternative set of value, to recognize the interdependence between us, people around us, people in other countries, and the planet. So feminist principles who seek to build on this idea of interdependence also call for a new social contract. The old social contract was based on the idea of individuals, agreeing a set of rules, but those contracts were always imbued with power. What we have to recognize is that the fight for a new social contract will have to be a struggle between those people who will resist it and those who will not. And in that new social contract, we have to think rights and responsibilities. Our rights to each other, our rights from each other, our responsibilities, but also our rights and responsibilities to the planet. When I was thinking about this, I thought to myself, okay, we recognize the rights of rivers. What responsibilities do the rivers have to us? Then I thought, well, a baby has rights, but we don't expect the baby to have responsibilities. So it is possible to have rights without responsibilities, because people often say, okay, you're giving rivers rights, you're giving trees rights. What are their responsibilities? Well, their responsibilities is to do what they do, just keep growing and thriving and flourishing and so on. If the idea of rights, responsibilities, and contracts comes out of a legal political discourse, the ethics of care, which has been promoted by a lot of feminists, comes out of a much more affective, a much more emotional place. And it argues that it should be the principle that governs our lives. Tronto, who has been a big name in this, talks about a societal view of care, the stuff of human life, reproducing people on a daily intergeneration basis, making lives livable, enriching connections between people and their environment. A species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. So this is a view of care as a moral compass. And when you think of ideas around the green economy, the ideas of the solidarity economy as something, the solidarity economy is based on caring about each other. It's based on cooperation, mutuality, etc. And when we think about the circular economy, that's about caring about things, not just chucking them away but repairing, using, sustaining as long as we can. But of course, the real world is better described by the politics of social reproduction. It is not characterized by the ethics of care. And what I've described earlier is the extent to which care is not treated as something that we value, but something that we exploit. And that we racialize, we marginalize, we turn people into minorities because that's what they're producing. So to some extent, we have to learn to tackle the politics of social reproduction through an alternative strategy. And so it seems to me that one very obvious arena in which we should be investing, precisely because it is less carbon intensive, is the care economy. Now, the World Bank, et cetera, have started to recognize, they have a human capital index, and they've started to recognize this idea of health and education as public goods because it will contribute to growth. Whereas I think, what about old people? What about disabled people? What about children? We cannot confine the public goods argument for collective responsibility for care only towards those who are or will be economically productive. Care has to be care for all human beings. So the feminist literature that I'm looking at is now talking about at least how much time have I got, Supriya?
Another 15 minutes.
Okay. So one can identify 3 or 4 different ways that we can think about care. One is care, collective responsibility for social infrastructure, the services, care, health, education, skills, and so on. And here I want to talk, and I don't know if Kitty is here, but I really liked her idea about, I use it all the time, being and becoming. I think there's some part of care that reproduces you as you are, your health, the survival, etc. And there's another part of care that is about becoming someone else, becoming more. It's collective capabilities. It's your inner capabilities. It is what we invest in people so that they feel an equal part, equal citizen in their societies. And care services, education, skills, health, and how we provide them, the characteristics of the delivery services are hugely important. But there is a physical element to care infrastructure. And of course, care services have been shown to generate far more jobs than construction. I'll give you one example, is that the average health or care job produces 26 times less greenhouse gas than the manufacturing job, over 200 times less than an agricultural, the commodified agriculture, and nearly 1,500 times less than a job in oil and gas sectors. So the care economy will generate jobs, but they will be jobs that are not carbon intensive. But there is a physical infrastructure to care, which I feel that my feminist colleagues sometimes ignore. We can think in terms of, and people are thinking in terms of green construction, of making construction far less carbon intensive. But in the meanwhile, for women in the global south, physical infrastructure is hugely important. Roads and bridges and so on, wells, clean stoves, public utilities, running water, all of this is also a part of their care provision, but it needs a physical infrastructure, and we have to factor that in. And the third is the care of physical of biodiversity. And that is the many women who care for the environment seek to preserve biodiversity on which their communities rely. They will be found earning a living in the small-scale subsistence-oriented farming, fishing, and forestry, taking care of common property resources. They will be found dealing with the impacts of climate change on the health of families and the effects of environmental destruction. But their work, because it's in between spaces, in between times, tend to get overlooked. I think now we are recognizing far more the need for acknowledging and rewarding those who are protecting ecological services. But my final point is, of course, social protection. And the reason is we have grown social protection from that early manifestation, its early appearance in our lives as safety nets, it has become a very powerful instrument, and it is increasingly taking on a systemic role. Because what social protection can do is not only provide the floor in a time of huge uncertainty, where we don't know where the next climate change, where the next disaster is coming from, or the next war, but it can also provide a bridge between where you are and where you could be. So it can provide a bridge to opportunities. It can provide, education as social protection, provide a bridge to opportunities, jobs, and so on. So social protection, I think, has to be thought of imaginatively as the kind of social, as both a safety net and an opportunity ladder and a bridge. All of this, of course, takes us to the macroeconomy. And we have a macroeconomy that was once, macroeconomics that was once designed to invest in the welfare state, that was once designed to promote education, at least in the global south, so that people could get better jobs, that was once designed to invest in people. We now have a macroeconomics that is completely designed to define what fiscal space is available to you and to encourage you to spend as little as possible on human beings and then as much as possible on those various equity and shares, et cetera, that I talked about earlier. So I think there are economists, and I think the Stiglitz report is the G20 report on inequality, the report on extreme poverty coming out of the UN, are trying to get us that this is not written in stone. This austerity macroeconomics are political choices. We once had a different kind of economics. And I think we need to start going back to that, because actually, I don't say that as an ideological statement. I say that because it is essential. We need to start investing in people, in knowledge, in everything that human beings can offer, because all the material world is going to go through a great deal of turbulence. And so we need to look at taxation, progressive taxation. We need to look at pre-distribution. To what extent can we use inheritance taxes to somehow cut back on some of the unfair advantages people have? To what extent can we invest in every single human being so they have a stock of capital to face the rest of the world? And redistribution. To what extent can we start taxing the obscenely wealthy, because there is no way that they need all that money. There is no way they need that money. Levying a 2% tax on billionaires would generate 200 to 250 billion annually, while a 2% tax on what I haven't heard of, centimillionaires, those worth over 100 million, would bring in 500 billion annually. That would be enough to cover the combined public debts of many low-income countries in 1 year, or substantially improve the economic prospects of millions of people around the world. Why are we not doing that? So we are not doing that. So I've put sort of general statements. We need a different kind of a macroeconomics that doesn't ignore nature, that doesn't ignore unpaid care work, that takes account of households, communities, markets, and states, and that looks at people and the planet. We need a macroeconomics that is based on the well-being of the wealthy, and that is an ideological statement, but has to be a well-being of the many rather than the profit of the few. And a macroeconomics that aspires to a world of universal carers, rather than turning everyone into universal breadwinners. We need a macroeconomics that trains all of us to care for each other, no matter what our gender. We actually need to get rid of the gender division of labor. And we need to allow people to specialize in what they think they are best at, what is their capability, what is their talents, and then I think we would flourish. However, and I'm going to come to an end here, the problem, of course, is, Polanyi talked about the counter movement. And we do have a counter movement, but it's fractured. It's fractured so much that we have a man in Britain who's accepted 500 million pounds from a crypto millionaire in Bangkok, stepping down from his seat, running for elections again, and presenting himself as the people versus the establishment. And God knows what other bits of money he's made. We have the narrative has been taken over by people who now control the levers of narrative. And I think Kaushik was talking yesterday about the media, newspapers, social media, and so on. So we are now faced with a divided counter movement. Right-wing populists who don't believe in climate change, who think immigrants are the real problem rather than millionaires in their society, who want to preserve culture and look back to a traditional past. And then we have progressives of various kinds, fighting for social justice, fighting against environment degradation. The problem is that this progressive movement is fractured. And it is very hard to know how we can bring it together as a universal force, a global force. A German climate activist did her research around Germany, and she asked people, when you think about the future, what do you think about? And she was very puzzled because they said, we think about a safe place for our children to play. We think about secure housing. We think about decent jobs. They're not worrying about climate change. But if you look at what they're saying this is the world that we have today, and this is the world we want. We want a world with safe places for children to play and good housing, etc. So my optimistic conclusion is that if we could get over the fracture, and identity politics, I'm afraid, has been part of the fracturing. Rather than looking at what unites us, what we have, and even, there's a woman in LSE called Leah Yippie, and she's written an amazing book called Freedom. And it's about growing up in Albania, socialist Albania. She came from a fairly privileged family, they spoke French. Her grandfather and her father pitched themselves on the side of the working class, right? They aligned themselves with the working class. Today, solidarity seems to mean you align yourself with someone who's exactly like you. Whereas I think solidarity means you cross divisions. You go and find people who share your values. And at the bottom of these values has to be class solidarity. It has to be class solidarity, because these inequalities we're talking about are class-based inequalities, whatever form they take. So my hope is that, and Kaushik and I, and Kaushik co-chaired the panel, we are trying to go beyond the GDP because of all the emissions that it has. And we have tried in our humble way to put in place some indicators. I will tell you one thing, absolutely no one is going to be happy with what we've got, right? Absolutely no one. But they will not say drop this, they will say add that, right? They'll say add that. But we were asked to not do too many because the SDGs are so many. And so we went up to 30 rather than 20. But believe me, when you read people, they will always say, why didn't you say this? Well, you have to draw the line. But I think we've put in there indicators of current well-being, indicators of equity and inclusion, and indicators of sustainability. The rest is up to the rest of the world, right? So I hope that if we could do the studies that ask people what really mattered to them, that we will find those on the right and those on the left. You take away all the tamasha about, going to the moon, like Richard Branson and Elon Musk. No, Bezos went during the, rest of us are locked at home. These people go to the moon. If we can get away from all that, I think people will care about affordable housing. They will care about safe spaces. They will care about green spaces. They will care about art and culture. They will care about nature. And if we could find a common platform, maybe we could put aside some of our differences and form that counter movement that Polanyi was talking about. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Naila. I mean, Naila's keynote clearly invites us to imagine what it would mean to move from an economy that's organized around growth to an economy that's organized around well-being and care. And in doing that, why feminist values, feminist analysis, and feminist priorities are essential, are absolutely essential to that reimagining. Now, may I invite questions from the audience? We'll take 2 to 3 questions at a time, Naila, and then you answer them. Okay, I see a hand going up there. Do you please pass on the mic to that? Could you please tell us your name briefly and your affiliation, and then ask your questions? Could I please ask everybody to keep questions to questions only, rather than statements, so we can have as many as possible and have a rich discussion? Thank you.
Thanks very much for your presentation. My name's RB from LSE. You've mentioned that, Nancy Fraser says that markets can actually be used to advance kind of like women's rights. And in your own work that I've cited in my own research, you talk about how markets can empower women in Latin America and elsewhere. And one of the points that you made is re-embedding the markets. So it seems to me that markets isn't the problem. It can actually be for good. But it seems that, especially in a space like this, where there's a lot of scholars from critical theory and critical tradition, market is being used as kind of like a virtue signal to as a metonym for neoliberalism or capitalism or whatever. Do you think that we should reclaim the word market? And do you think that we should think about market in a more nuanced way? Thank you.
Okay, another question, preferably around markets. Yeah, I saw a hand up there and then another hand there.
Hi, I'm Manohar from IIIT Delhi. Two questions about the ethics of care, right? And one related to the market, it's always claimed that markets change the nature of the good that, it is entrusted with. So one of the criticisms of converting care into a marketable commodity or bringing paid work or stuff into the market is it will change the nature of care, right? And it will transform why we care for care in the first place, right? Why we want care in the first place. The second question is, again, care is a very individual, in very intimate settings, we think about care, right? And that's why one of the challenges of translating an ethics of care into a broader agenda is then you might actually then leave out the very immigrants, the refugees that, because you have no reason to care about them, right? We care about people whom we are in close relationship with. So one of the challenges or criticisms, so I was wondering, how do you take that into account? Thank you.
Do you want to take one more question or take these two first?
I'll take these two.
Yeah, sure.
Is this right? Yeah. Markets. As I said, as I began, is that markets have existed long before, right? The alternative to markets, the extreme alternative to markets is a planned economy. And they don't have that good a reputation either. So I think what we are looking for are regulated markets, are markets that abide by the rules of society, that markets that don't require very poor people to sell their organs in order to survive. I think Kaushik yesterday talked about some of the regulations that one could use against these excessive profits that people make through doing absolutely no work at all. So I myself find the idea of markets, they become destructive and evil when they exacerbate the inequalities that already exist in society. But if you have a society where you have a certain amount of predistribution so that everyone enters the marketplace with roughly equal opportunities and a redistribution so that excessive profits could be reorganized, I think we could keep the market. I mean, that's the conclusion I've come to, but I'm very willing to be persuaded otherwise. On the ethics of care, that's a very important. One of the interesting insights from feminist economics about care, and now we're talking about the care we provide to people and commodifying it, is that as long as the carer, people are care, there is a number beyond which care becomes diluted. What defines a relationship as a caring relationship is the nature of that relationship, that that person who is caring for others, ill, elderly, etc., is able to give them attention, is able to give them what they need, is able to. I have a quote in my book from Renegotiating Patriarchy, where a woman said, my mother had so many children, she never could take care, she had no time to care for us. This is in an intimate domain. There is a level, the quality of care is going to deteriorate with the numbers of people you care for. So I think one has to be very careful that if you are talking about care as commodity, it has to be small scale, it has to be geared to local needs, recognition of what people need. So I agree with you that markets change the nature of the commodity, but markets, market provision of commodities should reflect what that. So you can market. Let's see. I don't know. You can make a whole number of cars. Doesn't matter how many cars, as long as it's productive, right? But I think it's Baumol that talked about an orchestra. You don't improve the quality of the music by having fewer people playing, right? Because the quality of the music depends on the numbers. So I think there is something around the care that in a reasonably well-planned economy, you would be careful about turning it into just another commodity. Caring for immigrants and people who are not like us. I think it was Vance who said, we only care about those. Communities exist that care about people that they don't know. An ethics of care is asking you not to care for everybody, but to care for what happens to everybody. Now, I can't talk for the whole of the human race, but when I teach, I often tell people, would you really be happy to live in a society where every time you went home, there were homeless people, immigrants of various kinds, whatever, scattered all around you? No, because your privilege is coming at their lack of privilege. So I think the caring part of it is, I want you to be happy so I can be happy. I want you to have enough to eat so I don't feel guilty eating. So I think there's a way of looking at interdependency, emotional and affective, which it's not there. I don't say it's there, but I think it is possible to build in the way that we built a competitive individualistic economy. An economy where a state had social protection for everyone universally because they were all citizens. Is it also an economy where people who might otherwise be on the margins feel like they belong to that society and do? I think the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, it reached the other Brazil. And for the first time, the other Brazil, Afro-Brazilian descendants, said that they felt like a part of that society. So I think we're talking about an ethics of care to bind us all together. I reject the word love because there are people who ask me, why don't we talk about an ethics of love? Because for me, love is a much more spontaneous thing. But care can be cultivated. But you can't really cultivate love. I don't think so. But I do have arguments with people about whether we should be taking care. I feel comfortable with care, so.
Right, there were already 2 hands up. Could you just pass the mic on down to the person? Oh.
Why are you ignoring poor Kaushik?
No, and then Kaushik, yeah.
First of all, thank you for the insightful talk. My name is Hari. I'm based at Toronto Metropolitan University in Canada. And my question is, you ended your talk with an optimistic note on the importance of the role of the counter movement. Counter movement. But you also pointed out that this counter movement is deeply divided. So I wonder if what you would say about the impact and the role of artificial intelligence, digital technologies that are evolving. And I think one of the uncertainties created by, in the present society world are the development of these technologies. So how would you see the role, impact of these technologies to the divided, counter movement and to the future of gender justice as a whole?
Do you want to just pass the mic to Kaushik? Okay.
Thank you very much, Naila. I've got lots of questions which I'll hold back for later. But let me ask you one about unpaid work, which has also come up in our own discussion on GDP. Huge problem. And the imbalances that you point out, the numbers are quite staggering. I want to ask a question on policy here. Where does one begin to correct this? Is it that we have to just try to get people to think differently, some of the norms changing? Or is there a responsibility on the part of the state that you interfere in, I don't quite know how. So if you have some early thoughts on which are the little exogenous handles in society which you can begin to move to make this change, because it has lived with us for such a long time. So the curiosity is about the policy, where it starts.
Take these two,
Yeah. The question about AI and the counter movement. Again, I'll go back to what Kaushik said yesterday. You know, AI in the hands of a few privileged, not very hardworking people has the potential for huge destruction, right? So AI should be a public good. It is one of the things, because it has such potential for destruction. But the other thing I think about AI, because it is making my life easier, right? It's making a lot of people's lives. It's making a lot of routine mechanistic jobs irrelevant because it can do them. So, you know, when we go back to Marx and we talk about the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom, I feel like AI has the potential to release us from the realm of necessity to doing all these boring routine jobs and to allow us into a realm of freedom where we could choose how we spent our time and what we did with it. That's not going to happen right now. Right now, what we are seeing is a decimation of jobs across the world and quite frightening tendency. I mean, I'm very concerned by the idea of AI being trained to look after people, you know, to look after the elder people because nobody will look after them. So I think when we think about it as a public good, we need to separate out the things that human beings have to do because they involve the care, the ethic, the love, and so on. And those things that AI can do quite well. So I'm not an expert on AI. So I think about it the way you are all thinking about it. Some of you are experts, but reading about it and worrying about it. But its ability to take away some of the most routine, boring, etc. work, if that was harnessed to create jobs that are more satisfying, that are more creative, that are more productive, then it would not have to be such a problem. As for the counter movement, you know, all I see is digital and AI technologies being used to create a world of suspicion and lies and misinformation. So I don't see what role AI has in trying to give us the courage and the solidarity and so on. So I feel I was at the Bosch Foundation in Germany, and some guy who used to be at IES and works a lot on AI, he says these top people in the AI world, they don't mix with people very much. You know, they're quite unsociable. And I don't know if it's true, but I'm telling you what he said. He said they think we are like the Matrix. You know, we are an extension of a game that they're playing, and none of us are real. And I think, are these the people who are kind of running AI? So I'm not going to work on it. I really am not. But I see, like all technologies, scope for good and a scope for horrible, horrible forms of destruction.
There's a panel on AI tomorrow.
Yes, yes. And on Kaushik's question, I was using this idea of the universal carer is from Nancy Fraser. And she says there are three models we could have. One is we could compensate mothers, or, you know, people who look after people with, you know, cash transfers, etc. But in the kind of economy we have, they will always be left behind. We could create a model of universal breadwinners, which means that everybody has to be out there to work. But I think Claudia Golden's latest book about greedy jobs, one of the things she says is, even if you're highly educated, you know, her kind of person, you marry someone like you, and you start out at the same level of wages, you know, over time, they develop, because there's something called attention. There's something, you know, someone has to be keeping an eye on what's going on. So simply creating a world of universal breadwinners is also not going to work because, so she talks about what are the kind of policies, and I've forgotten what she said, but what are the kinds of policies? But she includes things like maternity leave and paternity leave. She includes things, and I would say I would include things like the community provision of care. You know, my PhD student has done work in Colombia, and she says, you know, men won't do the care work at home, but they're quite happy doing community work, looking after young men and young women, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe we should socialize care far more so that it becomes possible for both to do it. So I think it's a question that I think about a lot. But I would say it has to begin in education. You know, I think we need to rethink the kind of education that we are providing, creating a whole bunch of people who don't get jobs, right? Whole bunch of people who don't want other jobs, even though those other jobs could be useful. I think we are, and I really do feel a sense of urgency. You know, I like to say to people, this is my little thing, you know, I am now 70 plus years old. I have no children. I have no stake in the future. But I do care about what kind of world we're going to leave behind. And I think a very important part of changing that world is in the kind of education we provide. I think people who are trained as economists should be forced to study humanities and the arts. People who are studying the arts should be forced to understand a bit of economics. Engineers should be taught how to paint and write. You know, we shouldn't be creating these highly specialized people who don't know how to think outside the box. And in that role, I think we should ask people to imagine a world where there are no gender division of labor, where people do what they do because they want to do it, because they can do it, because other people will help them to do it. So I think this whole idea of, and that's why those feminists are focused so much on the gender. Why should it be just because you're born a certain biological sex that your whole life is now charted for you? You know, this is what you do, this is what you do. So I think if we could begin with early education. She asked us to reimagine, right? I'm not being practical, but I am giving you a vision that I think I believe in and that I think will make us all happier as people.
Yeah, when you started talking about engineers painting, I had this vision of me doing home economics at school, and I failed that module because I refused to engage with it because it was only girls and boys were not allowed. And I wish that wasn't the case. So this is the whole thing about sort of breaking down these gender walls between roles. I saw quite a flurry of hands there, and I really don't know, so forgive me if I'm not going in the right order, but there's a gentleman in the middle, and there's a lady down here. Persistent hand holders, so I shall give the
Hello,
mic
Professor.
to you.
Yeah, I'm Guru from India. I'm just thinking beyond the binaries. This question is like outside the context of what you have presented. Do you think non-monogamy can contribute to gender justice? Like, what do you think? Whether it can also reproduce inequalities?
Non-monogamy.
Non-monogamy, like the relationship.
Polygamy, you mean?
Sorry.
Polygamy.
I mean, I am at the. It's polygamy is like a part of like non-monogamy. I'm just like asking like in that way. I mean, sorry if it is out of context.
Clarify. Be more specific.
No, non-monogamy is like a growing relationship styles where people practice, like they have like more than one partner. So polyamory is a part of it. Polygamy is also a part of it. So I just wanted to, it's like out.
It's not.
Should we take it,
Yeah.
the second question as well and then
Yes.
tackle both of them? Yeah.
Sure, mine is less exciting, I think.
Thank God for that.
Kind of building on your last answer, actually, you were talking about how we reform care and education to allow for a universal care model. I'm curious about your thoughts about how we reform paid labor to allow for a universal care model, because of course, the way we currently structure paid labor is, or it was assumed in the way we structure paid labor that it would be, one person being the breadwinner, one person doing full-time care work. That's no longer the case, but we haven't really restructured paid labor. So how do you reimagine that?
I'll take the monogamy question, but I'm not quite sure I've understood it, but I think I have.
He is going to present your rationale to his partner. So be
Okay,
careful what
all
you
right.
say.
All right. Okay, I am old-fashioned, right? I'm old-fashioned. I think there's a point in your life when you're quite young, when you probably have many different relationships. They may have elements of sex, they may have elements of love. I think as you get older, you form attachments to certain people. You can't go on the rest of your life, kind of being non-monogamous. And the care part of it, and he was talking about the intimate domain, you start to invest in relationships that come to mean more to you. That doesn't have to be legalized monogamy or anything like that. But I guess that's as far as I would go. I think as you get older, it loses its appeal, the freedom to have relationships with I think they're called polyamorous, right? Isn't that the word?
Yeah, I think so.
Polyamorous, yes.
So basically you're allowed, but I'm not.
No way. Everybody's allowed. Yes.
Question on that.
On paid, yeah. I think it's a bit like what Kaushik is asking as well. What does a universal care model mean? And what does it mean given that we will continue to be engaging in paid work and so on? So I talked about paternity leave, maternity leave. The people at the Hot and Cool Foundation in Berlin are talking about shorter working days, so that it is possible for both people to. One interesting thing, in the 70s, there was a big argument within the feminist movement about whether you wanted a shorter working week or a shorter working day. And the women wanted a shorter working day. And the men wanted a shorter working week, because then of the 3 days of the week they had off, they could go hunting and gathering and all the other stuff. But there is something about how much time is sucked up by your paid work that leaves you very little time to do the unpaid work, and who is bearing the division of responsibilities. So I think I'm going to go back and read a bit more about this, because I've not given you very satisfactory answers. But the idea that we should all be responsible for caring for each other, caring for the environment, seems to me to be a very appealing one. At the moment, again in Germany, because I spent this time, I interviewed someone from GIZ, and I wanted to talk about the climate. She wanted to talk about care. And the reason she wanted to talk about care is when she got married, she and her husband decided when they had the first child, they would both go to 80% of their contracts. She went to 80% of her contract, but when her husband went to his employer, he said, well, you have to choose the baby or the job. So somewhere we also have to change the mindsets of the people who run jobs and corporations and so on. Yeah.
So I have seen your hand and I'm coming to you, but there are 2 questions online that have been there for a while. So I'm just going to read them out. This is Bincy Matthew. Hi, Naila. This is an academic setting, but how do you convince policymakers about care or a care economy for people who are seen as unproductive, for instance, on account of poor health?
Yeah. Well, that is one of the problems within feminism, is there's a whole literature that has grown up, the Women's Budget Group, IPAC, etc., who are trying to show that investment in the care economy will create jobs, right? But for the bank and the IMF, there's a kind of a trade-off between how much you invest in people who are going to be productive and those who are not going to be productive. I think, maybe we should ask Kaushik, but I think if I were to go to make this argument with a policymaker, one thing, of course, would be the jobs, that there would be these jobs that were generated that were far less carbon intensive, etc. The second would be, it is Radhika's question, what is the economy for? Is the economy just to grow and grow and grow and create wealth? Or is the economy also about our ability to look after each other? If you are so fixated on a growth paradigm and don't care about its distribution, then of course these arguments are not going to make sense to you. But a public good is something that is good for all of society. And if I have an elderly mother or a disabled child or whatever. And I think the entire responsibility is going to come on me as an individual because the state doesn't consider them productive. Then you are disseminating an ethos that is not in line with it. Look, I don't think that the IMF and the World Bank are going to be changing their minds overnight. But I do think that if we have this counter movement, if we have a counter movement, then we should insist that particularly those who cannot look after themselves have priority in terms of care. And that goes, we are now moving into ideological territory, right? We're moving into territory about different kinds of ethics and different kinds of what matters. And my hope is that if we do these questions, look at the well-being economy and all of that, that we will find that absolutely nobody wants a system where people who are not productive are left to their own devices. And only those people who are going to contribute to the economy are going to be looked after. You look bad, the bank looks bad if it's arguing that.
Yeah, I mean, the next question is actually quite close to this. So I'll quickly read that. I was thinking of coming to the room, but I'll just do this. Do you believe, this is a question from Salma Ibrahim, do you believe there's an intersection between the economics of care and the economics of identity, especially when it comes to refugees and their integration in host societies?
I'm not sure I understand that question. The economics of care and the economics of identity? Can you interpret?
When it comes to refugees and their integration in host societies, so I mean, refugees who are potentially not productive for a time, they need support and they need to be integrated in host communities. So there's a care there, but there is also identity. I think this connects to the question that came from here about, why are we caring for these refugees? They are not us. So,
I think if we are talking about an economy that is based on ideas about care and well-being, we can't get to pick and choose who we care for and who we don't. Because by doing that, we undermine the whole basis of the ethics that we're trying to promote. Like the World Bank cannot choose just because you're not going to contribute to the economy, you're not going to be looked after. You can't say just because you're a refugee, we're not going to be looking after you. On that, I will also say one other thing. And we did this, I did a thing about citizenship, right? And we were talking to an American woman, and they were fighting for the rights of immigrants, documented, undocumented, to have driver's license so that they could go out there have jobs. But they were a part of it, but they also said, you have this right, but you also have responsibilities. So, when we talk about, rights, except for rivers and babies, generally come with some kind of responsibilities. So refugees who come, who are fleeing war and, all of that, come to a country, they're looking for asylum, they're looking for help, but in as far as they can, they owe something to that society. Because it's not a transaction. It's a contractual set of obligations. So you can't be the person who just comes and takes and takes and takes. You also do what you can to give back. And I hear so many people often say, I want to give back to society. So I can't generalize in any way because you don't know the situation of people who are fleeing. But I do believe that, you've come to a society, they're going to look after you, and you will do what you can to give back.
Yeah, shall we move on? Right, sure. There's a lady who's had a hand up there for a while. Yeah, you have the mic? Okay, could we just get the mic to her, please? And you after that.
Hello, Naila. This is Aisha from Pakistan. First of all, thank you very much for benefiting us all with your words. Every word that you say, it helps us in many ways. We always gain from whatever you say, whatever you share with us from your bank of knowledge. So thank you very much for that.
That was my
fan
job.
of yours. Yeah. I'm a great fan of yours, I must tell you this. So now coming back to what you were talking about, social protection. Yes, I do agree that it has a role to play in well-being economy. But have you considered the other aspect of social protection also when it is used as a political tool to create vote bank, but particularly in economies where poverty is very high and education is low, and there are harmful gender social norms, patriarchy prevails. So in such economies, social protection, instead of translating into well-being economy, tends to create more inequalities or perpetuate the existing inequalities. Because people, when they get money without doing anything in their hand, and they're too poor, what they do is they don't tend to spend that money or invest that money into education, into improving those harmful gender social norms. So violence keeps, it perpetuates, it stays there, patriarchal harms stay there. So under such circumstances, I, in my humble opinion, feel that social protection tends to create more harm than do more good, because people become complacent. They try to spend more on dowry and getting their daughters off with whatever little money they get. So in that respect, I think social protection
Can you bring that to a close?
does become a challenge when it tends to create more inequalities instead of translating into well-being. So what's your comment on that? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more question from the gentleman here, and then...
Thank you very much. It's Theo Papayan from the Open University.
Good. Yeah.
Thanks very much for your talk. You mentioned redistribution, you mentioned public goods, and these echo the arguments of Mariana Mazzucato, the latest arguments of Mariana Mazzucato. But Mazzucato is very much convinced that capitalism can be corrected from the top down with very strong state. So I wonder whether you share the same conviction. Thank you.
I'm going to, we're running out of time, so I'm just going to ask the relay room if they have a question. I know you have a question, so can you just turn on? Yeah.
Hi, can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Come on.
Hi, Professor Naila. Thank you for a wonderful session. My name is Ehsan, University of South Wales. So I have been researching on international students and their lived experience in UK, and it is about female international students who study in UK, but also they are having a double life, working in night shift, day shift to manage living expense, accommodation, and etc. So I'm just wondering, do you want to conceptualize that? How would you conceptualize this hidden labor, hidden underpaid labor that people are actually working with, like £5, £4.60 in a stationery shop overnight or in the morning shift? How do you conceptualize that? Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, on social protection, like AI, like anything, in the wrong hands, it can be used in a destructive way. When social protection first came, when the idea of safety nets first came out, there was a lot of hostility amongst economists because they said it would create a dependency mentality. Research from all around the world, and I have written an article about the way, if you don't do proper research, you feed into your own prejudices, right? So for instance, in South Africa, they thought that the pensions to the elderly was creating a whole generation of dependent men with the grandmother getting the pension. But somebody who knew the South African context actually found that it was allowing younger women, daughters, to migrate in search of work while the grandmothers looked after children. So in essence, I think the consensus around social protection is that people don't use it badly. conditional or unconditional. If your government in Pakistan is designing forms of social protection that allow harmful or adverse or discriminatory norms to be reproduced, it's time they thought again. It's time that they redesigned what kinds of social protection transfers they were giving to make sure that Bangladesh has benefited hugely from social protection. It's benefited from the food for work, education for work, secondary school stipends. Nobody ever saw these as reinforcing. On the contrary, they allowed a lot of women much greater agency than they had had before. So there's nothing inherent in social protection that makes it have these effects. It's about what was the intention behind that particular form of social protection that you're talking about. Are you talking about Mariana Mazzucato? Yeah. I like all that work, and I like the idea of a mission-driven economy, and I like the latest thing about the common good economy. It's the getting from here to there that troubles me. So one can have these wonderful ideas, but if they are in the hands of a government who is going to use their power to drive the opposite of a mission-bound economy, then that's why I'm moving more and more to the idea of civil society. Because unless there's a force willing to hold corporations and governments to account, there are no guarantees. And what we are seeing, I think the world is now ruled by more autocracies than democracies. And that's why people like Zoran Mamdani offer hope, because the message they were giving was about the cost of living. It was about the things that were close to people's hearts and that were shared by people no matter what their identities and so on were. The reason I have some hope with Andy Burnham in Britain is he too is talking about an economy for the people, rather than a watered-down version of neoliberalism, which is what we've had with every single government, or a really bad version of neoliberalism, which we have in this trust. So I like anything that Mariana Mazzucato says. I like everything that all of these more thoughtful and enlightened, and Kaushik here is one of them, economists say. But there's a politics to all of this, and that politics, as we are responsible for that. It's up to us to kind of use what we do as academics, what we do as NGO people, what we do as local government people, to try and put in power the people who will be more accountable for the good, for the common good, for the good of society. And the third point about the international students, you're describing what I was describing about the commodification of labor and the commodification of very vulnerable forms of female labor. And this is going to continue as long as we have this very deregulated economy. We are seeing universities in the UK being turned into neoliberal institutions. People are on casual contracts. There's no established universities are going out of business, and that's not because are going to collapse. And that's not because we don't need education, but because they're being asked to make profits of a kind that universities were never set up to do very well. So I think with the precarious work, it's a part and parcel of that same problem. I like listening to people, economists and others, who talk about these things as if they were possible. When we had Margaret Thatcher saying there is no alternative, right? When we had this idea that there is no alternative become a part of the common sense of society, that if you want anything else, it's too idealistic. But all of these things have happened in the past. We've had good governments. We've had, even in the global south, we've had the aspiration to provide people with social security and so on. So I think hopelessness, the feeling that nothing is ever going to change is the worst thing that someone can be telling us. I think it's the idea of having, somebody called it the politics of the possible, possibilism. These things are possible. I know that they're not going to happen tomorrow, and I know I'll be dead long before, but if we don't believe these things can change,
Well, sadly, we are 6 minutes over the time, so there's no more time for any more questions, but I hope you will join me in resoundingly thanking Naila for her amazing talk. Thank you. And more discussions over coffee, tea, please. Yeah.
Yeah, there's now coffee being served on the first and third floors.